far as rising interest rates is concerned. And even if you look at the economies that are pace setters, from the US, for example, they have had to raise their interest rate. The Fed has had to raise their interest rates 7 times in the year 2022. The UK, again, have had to have the same measures. All other OECD countries have had to do the same, and especially trying to tame the inflation that we have globally. It is still present, unfortunately. We also are faced with the same challenge we faced in November, insofar as disruption of supply chain is concerned. And this has, of course, been premised on what is happening in Russia and Ukraine. And again, that has brought about another challenge, where we have seen majority of the global economies across the globe adopting nationalism. Most of the countries now are looking inward because the disruption from what is happening in Russia, Ukraine, have necessitated that many countries have to look for supply chains that they can control. And the supply chains that you can only control are the supply chains within your boundaries. And therefore, that is also another challenge insofar as globalization is concerned, that out of the challenges in supply chains, then many economies are looking inward and therefore are adopting nationalism. Coming to the local perspective and the circumstances locally, they are not very far detached from what is happening internationally. One of the challenges that we have now in the country, and I'm sure all of us are aware of it, is drought. We are facing a ravaging drought, almost unprecedented for the last 25 years and above. This, of course, has brought about inflation. And I believe even as we talk about inflation in the international arena, the inflation we are facing in this country, and especially now in Kenya, is more exacerbated by the drought. It is more inflation driven by scarcity more than availability of or more money in the economy. And therefore, again, that is a challenge that is cutting across globally, but also locally, we are feeling it. And I don't need to buttress that point, because we all know about the high cost of living insofar as the commodities that Kenyans consume every day is concerned, some of it stemming from drought. Because even as we come up with the formula of inflation, food takes up a huge proportion of it. And again, that is a component of drought that I referenced there before. In the year 2021, December, the inflation was around 5.7%. The same period last year, that is 2022, it was around 9.1%. And therefore, that again justifies what the pain that Kenyans are going through at the moment. And of course, now the general conditions have led to unemployment. And when I'm talking about the local conditions, I'm talking about macro in terms of the blanket, and also I'd want to mention a few that are sectoral. Because in sectoral, just to cite a few, and I'm not trying to paint a gray picture of the circumstances in our economy, if you look, for example, at our education sector, we are transforming now into CBC. That comes with its cost. It is an opportunity to Kenyan, but it is a cost in terms of the physicals. We are now hiring over 30,000 teachers. It is an opportunity for many Kenyans, which is a good thing, but also a challenge in terms of the physical. In the recent past, Prof, I've had an opportunity to meet with the majority of our vice-chancellors from our various universities. When I was in school, majority of them were bubbling and happy. But the majority I've been meeting of late are fallen and sad because of the state of our universities. And I'm sure even the president is coming up with a way to recalibrate again how we fund our universities, because it is cutting across. Every university in Kenya, they are indebted. They are not even meeting their obligations. So sector-wise also, we have challenges, and I'm only citing education to represent the others that needs our input. Of course, the rising debt. And I suppose now, and I don't want to purport to work for the Treasury, we must be approaching somewhere close to 10 trillion Kenya shillings in terms of debt. And we have to think about this. There is a great correlation if you study the trends in Kenya from 1963 up to date. There is a clear correlation between our debt to GDP ratio and GDP growth. And I don't know what comes first, Prof, because if you look at Kenya from 1963 coming to 1980, we had a GDP growth of just around 6.9%, which is exemplary. Around the same time, our debt to GDP ratio was around 28.6%. Coming now to 1980s, coming up to around 2000, we had our debt to GDP ratio rising to around 53.1%, while also our GDP itself was contracting in terms of comparative from the other period that I referenced. I mean, it was slower than the previous. From 2002, coming to 2012, again we had a lower GDP, debt to GDP ratio, coming all the way to around 34% in June of 2022, at a period when we also had a rising GDP. Now, from 2013, let's say to last year thereabout, we had a spike in terms of our debt to GDP ratio up to the close documented figure of around 68 point something. And I believe it could be higher because it's a matter of the other side of GDP. And around the same time, we had GDP growth again falling up to lows of below 3% in some period within that time. So we have a challenge in terms of debt is concerned. And we have to bite the bullet as Kenyans. And I'm not saying that debt is entirely bad. Debt is not entirely bad. Even the other time you were here, we talked about it because it is a perpetual challenge that we have to face, and especially in the macro sense. Even some of our development partners, their countries are also indebted, actually more than Kenya in terms of debt to GDP ratio. Japan is over 250% debt to GDP ratio. And we like referencing those countries because they do well. US is over 100%. Other countries, even within the OECD, are also over 100%. But the circumstances are very different. We cannot compare a cow, for example, with an orange. The situation of our country, Kenya, is so different from those other countries that we have to look at ourselves singularly insofar as debt is concerned. How much is the cost of, for example, the Japanese government borrowing? To some point, it goes to negative rates. The 10-year board of Japan, compared to the Kenyan, you'll find that there is nothing actually comparable. And therefore, we cannot continue to perpetuate borrowing by referencing countries that borrow and they are doing well. And also citing Japan itself, insofar as whether accumulating debt is a good thing. They have accumulated debt. The country, again, faces deflation. And after facing deflation associated with this huge debt, we find that the GDP of Japan has not had a real growth for the last 30 years. And therefore, then, looking at all the global scenarios, and especially insofar as debt is concerned, I believe we have a challenge as a country that we lower our debt to GDP ratio, because our country is not to a level where we should be comparing with those other countries that have borrowed more than us. Cost is one. The other thing is, of course, currency. Those other countries, they borrow in their own currencies, for example, because majority they borrow internally. Here in Kenya, when you have a disruption in terms of our currency, even in the current scenario, if our external debt is 4 trillion shillings, a disruption of only 1% in our currency puts a load of over 40 billion to our nominal debt. And therefore, again, this is something we have to keep on working on so that we don't add up unnecessary expense, and especially in our physicals. The other thing is the use. We can no longer continue to borrow any money, even 1 shilling, to put into recurrence. All this money has to go into investments. I also want to say something brief about the budget composition, because that is exactly the reason we are here. And I'll be talking about the current year, financial year. And on the budget side, and I'm sure we are all aware, there is now the revenue side and there is the demand side for money. That is the expenditure side. On the revenue side, what fills our basket? Number one is our direct taxes. And we are proposing in the current financial year's budget to raise around 2.14 trillion shillings. I hope it will go higher. This is also a challenge in terms of macro, because if you look at the revenues that we collect as a country, we are just around 14 to 15% of our GDP in terms of our revenues. And therefore, we are collecting around 2.1. But if we are to collect, and I'm sure even the KRA is represented here, if we are to collect money, and especially those taxes, around the same percentage as our peers within the economies that looks like us, who collect around 25%, we would actually be collecting 3.5 trillion Kenya shillings. We would actually be drawing a budget that is surplus, not deficit. If we are to raise revenues at levels of South Africa, which is around 28.6%, we will be collecting 4 trillion Kenya shillings. Therefore, this is just trying to show that we have enough internal resources if we are to use GDP as a measure. We only need to streamline how we collect taxes. We become more innovative so that we can collect more, because the opportunity is there insofar as GDP is concerned, global, which is 14%. The other one is A&A. A&A at around 300 billion, and I believe we can do better. We can do better in terms of optimizing the collection of revenues at source. Grants is not our obligation, it is the obligation of the giver, and therefore we may not determine or do much about it. But deficit now is around 870 approximately billion. If we do that for the next 5 years, I don't think we will have a stable country. And I am just buttressing the other point I had about debt. On the expenditure side, and I'm doing this to show that all of us who are represented here, we are actually trying to pull the blanket to our side. The blanket is not enough for everyone, and it is winter. The resources are not sufficient, and therefore we are scrabbling for them. That is why I'm giving this simple data. The expenditure side, the money that goes to our salaries, to pay us, majority of us here and others, working for the 49 million Kenyans, is approximately 900 billion. The recurrent non-salary, the recurrent to maintain us while still earning salary, is around 600 billion, referencing this financial year. We have CFS, debt repayment and others, payment to commissions. It is still a huge budget at around 860 thereabout billion shillings. And then we have another legal obligation of around 370 billion to set to our counties. It's not just legal, but it's also as we support devolution. Therefore, I have given that reality so that we see clearly we must work on our physicals in terms of reducing our deficit and work on our revenues so that we have a more balanced budget. What are the general points I would want us to have in mind as we progress to make the basis for our economic growth in 2023-2024? Our economy, and especially, let's say, for as long as we can remember, has been growing on the basis of three things. One is public investment. Two is public consumption. And number three is private consumption. And I would want us now to shed off these official faces we are wearing so that we can digest this point. This is our country, Kenya. Here is a map. The GDP growth we keep reporting. What has been the driver? What are the drivers of these whatever percentages we were giving? One is the roads we are building, the railways, and etc. That is public investment. The other side is public consumption, including the part of the recurrent that I gave in our budget for this financial year. And number three is private consumption. If we are to draw a circle, public investment, public consumption, and then there is private consumption, we can see there is something lacking for that circle to complete, which I suppose is private investment, private production. So we end up having an economy where consumption is powered by imports. If you look at, for example, manufacturing imports in Kenya is to a tune of 1 trillion shillings. But manufacturing exports is around 800 billion. So the deficit there is 800 billion. If you look at the physical I gave about the macro deficit, the physical deficit, it is 862 billion. And you can see they correlate. I'm just trying to cut down the points so that I finalize, we give Prof time. So we have to look at how we can improve this private production. Because this private production, if it completes, then rising consumption becomes a good thing to our economy. But then we have inequalities in Kenya. The haves. And those who don't have actually don't have. So we have a few people with very high purchasing power. What does the high purchasing power do? High purchasing power comes with refined preferences. These refined preferences, some cannot be found within. And I'm sure most of us here can relate. People with high purchasing power, their furniture, the taste of furniture cannot be found locally. So their taste for furniture comes from somewhere else. The gazras they drive, of course, majority are not found locally, but they are at a higher expense. The suits they wear cannot be found locally. So they end up now wearing an imported suit. So this now refined tastes, again, adds into the load of imports. And therefore, if we span out this private production, I believe it solves many problems. It solves almost triple rents. Employment comes in there, taxes comes in there, and rising productivity for every Kenyan, which leads to rising income for majority of Kenyans. As I come to the close, in terms of budget, you know, I have been scratching my head. We are currently in the process of doing a supplementary budget. Kenya, we do supplementary budgets. We can even do a third one. Why do we do these supplementary budgets? And why do they even go to the core? Because I believe a supplementary budget is correcting an error you made before. So we make an error, we correct, and then we make another one, we correct. I believe, and this is the direction of even the president, that once we make our budget, we must be able to live with that budget for a whole year. And if we must have a supplementary budget, as we make the budget, and I'm sure we'll be also proposing some legal safeguards to that, there are some things we must safeguard in our main budget that must not be touched in our supplementary budget. So that you as an accounting officer, once your money is ring-fenced, for example, for development, you don't need to spend time chasing for your money. Number two, PS, let me just be honest, and our CS. Majority of these people, because I can see the faces, they are my friends. We have interacted in many forums. Majority of the people in government institutions, they spend their money in Treasury chasing money. They spend their time, in Treasury chasing money. Why should a Director General, instead of building roads, be chasing money? They chase money because anytime this budget can be cut, a supplementary budget can always come. And therefore, you want your money as soon as possible. We need to find even legal safeguards that when we budget, then the accounting officer responsible for example, NIA, should go on to do irrigation and now leave Treasury, which is timed, to release their money, and they should be sure that the budget we do, for example, the one we are doing in April, that there's some money that is safeguarded up to the next financial year when it is ending. And supplementary budget should only come to correct absorption challenges. Where we see we give money, there is no absorption. I believe that is the only point where we should be doing supplementary budgets. CEC is also in counties. Most of the CEC's finance, they spend more time in the office of the Controller of Budget more than they spend in their office. I wonder whether they are paid to follow money or money should follow them, then they do work. Again, I believe that is a component of poor budgeting. We must make a budget that lasts for an entire year. Thank you very much. I wish you a prosperous new year.
Let's give the chairman another round of applause. It's now my distinguished honor to welcome the Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury and Economic Planning, Professor Njuguna Ndung'u. Karibu, Waziri.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you very much, Dede Nyoro, for that presentation. You know, it's always difficult when you follow up with someone who is taller than you. You're trying to bring yourself down. Let me say that I'm very happy to be here, or invited guests. The chairperson, Budget and Appropriations Committee of Parliament, Bwana Dede Nyoro. I'm very happy to speak after you because you preempt and make my work very easy in terms of what I'm going to say. Let me say that my colleagues, principal secretaries that are here, the development partners and invited guests, members of the fourth estate, ladies and gentlemen, let me say that I'm very happy. Oh, come on, this thing is not well positioned. Do I speak standing? Okay, no problem. If it's okay, you can hear me? Okay, it is my pleasure to be here this morning and especially to officiate on the opening of public sector hearings for the financial year 2023-2024 and the medium-term budget preparations. And the purpose of organizing this forum is to give all stakeholders an opportunity to interrogate the proposed sector budgets and give their inputs on planned government priorities as well as programs for the period. And I'm very happy that Dede Nyoro just put us through what we need to do. It's only that he also talked about supplementary budget that is coming up, but I think most of the time the supplementary budget comes in to cover the changing circumstances, especially economic environment, but also changing priorities of government. But that is in addition to what he has added, so we do believe that it comes in to help us to shape the reality in terms as we go along. But the most important thing is that the activity we are starting today, that is supposed to address market failures and even problems that arise, as well as institutional, should I say, shortcomings. So for us, it's very, very important that we get suggestions from the public and the Kenyans in terms of where we are going and how we deal with those challenges that are facing Kenyans from time to time, and especially in this planning cycle. I therefore wish to sincerely thank all the participants for finding time to attend to this event and make presentations as well as discussions, and I do hope a fair amount of effort and even positive discussions will take place, and we'll take that outcome very well and very positively so that we can actually implement the issues that we'd like to have to implement. Let me briefly talk about public participation. Ladies and gentlemen, public participation in the budgeting process is an important requirement in our Constitution, but it's also important in diverse ways. First, it enables the stakeholders to engage in the planning process to identify their development needs and improve the process, and also propose homegrown solutions to address the challenges that I've seen, the challenges that may come in the future. In this respect, it means that it becomes an endogenous process of owning the process and also helping us actually to develop in terms of the endogenous constraints that we have. The second one is that it helps in promoting inclusivity in the budget-making process. And so it helps us to enhance a greater ownership and participation of Kenyans in subsequent program implementation, and even trying to account or even to question the process in future. Third, it allows harmonization of government interventions and also minimizes duplication of efforts and wastage of resources. Fourth, it enables the citizens to better appreciate the resource constraint, and I'm very happy that Mheshimiwa Dede Nyoro alluded to that, because if you don't understand the resource constraint, then it means that you cannot appropriately address the appropriate solutions. And also, for us, it is very, very important that it allows us to prioritize what programs can be taken at a particular time. And finally, it enhances the openness and transparency by providing a platform for receiving feedback from the public on the effectiveness of public spending, and that is a very, very important step towards accountability. Let me turn